Okie dokie. Welcome. First thing to talk about, we had questions about the assignments in the first exam. The first exam will be next Thursday on chapters 1, 2, and 3. We'll be finishing up 3 today, or started today, finishing up on Tuesday. The exam will take 50 minutes, and then we'll start in on chapter 4, and then the next exam will be on the next 3 chapters before we go on fall break. And will be updating today the syllabi that will have a tentative course listing for the exams and things like that. So you'll be able to jump in and check it out and be okay with that. And then again, the format will be matching, fill in the blank, and then short essay and then longer essays. And given the amount of time, what I will more than likely do is have one required essay. I can do one required essay, or you can pick one of 2 essays to answer. Do you have a preference?
Yeah, I like the second one.
Pick one of 2? Okay. So we'll pick one of 2 of the long essay. That's what, probably 3-4 paragraphs. The short responses, if you can't knock it out in 2 paragraphs, you kind of miss the point. And then we'll have the matching and the fill in the blank. And again, the way it's structured is if you know all the material, the matching and the fill in the blank shouldn't take you more than 10 minutes if you take your time. If you don't know it, you can spend the entire amount of time trying to sort it out. And then that gives you about 40 minutes for the essay portion. So we'll go from there, and then we'll move on to chapter 4. Any questions so far on the kind of things we've talked about and covered? I was out of town all day yesterday, so I didn't get the Tuesday PowerPoint posted. I'll get posted tonight if you want to go back and review it. And I was always telling Tristan, any of you ever traveled to Augusta? I found a great new sushi restaurant yesterday. Yeah, it was just off of Washington Boulevard in Augusta. And like I was telling him, I'm entering 2.5 years of my dental process. So with any luck, I shouldn't have to have blender turkey this Thanksgiving. So I'm really excited about that. So over the last 2.5 years, I've eaten lots and lots of sushi. So anyway, that it is. So that's where we're headed. The quote of the day comes right out of your text, which I thought was a very important thing to think about. By questioning taken for granted assumptions about disasters, and introducing new theoretical perspectives that sensitize researchers to features of the social order and processes that were previously overlooked, recent scholarship promises to transform the field of disaster studies. So there's a lot in that little bit. What do we mean taken for granted assumptions? See how easy these things are? Just a piece of cake, right? And so, that goes back to stuff, we kind of touched on, biologically, we are self-organizing systems. We look for routines and patterns on how to behave and how to act. And that's wonderful because it's how we get dressed in the morning, it's how we learn to read, it's how we learn to tie our shoes, all that stuff is terrific. The problem is we tend to come to rely on that self-organization, those previous patterns we've seen. And unless we question what we see and do, or are forced to question, we sometimes overlook. I mean, you see that in law enforcement when, based on their past experience, they focus in on a particular person. And since they think they've got the right person, they find evidence to support it. Well, we do that the same way. We do that the same way when we deal with stuff. When we go to restaurants, we tend to order the same things over and over and over. There are a group of people I go once a month with, and I swear to gosh, we've been going to lunch probably the last 3 years, once a month. We go to the same restaurant, and they order the exact same menu item. So I guess there's one thing to be said for knowing what you like and sticking with it. But there's also something to be said for trying new stuff, because there might be something else you enjoy. So we have this tendency to fall back on our habits and patterns and routines. And most of the time, they're great. The problem is when you're doing research, when you're looking at background, when you start doing your papers, and again, we'll make that assignment when we come back from fall break And so we'll have that, and you'll notice I'm adding some resources that are in the PowerPoint, which will be posted online, but they'll also be posted as bookmarks in Wolfden, so you can access them both ways. And so what we have to do is get over these assumptions that people are going to behave in a particular way, or that storms are going to act a certain way, or whatnot. And you have that all the time when you do research. We look back for those routines and habits and patterns. And why do social order and processes get to be important? And your text talks a lot about that in this chapter, and we've talked about it early on. I mean, what do social order and processes have to do with disasters and emergency management? We use the big E word Tuesday when talking about the population. EXP? Expectations. I love Hangman. Expectations, we talked about that, right? Is that sometimes people have inflated sense of what expectations they should have from government, from first responders. And we mentioned that one of the problems is they don't seem to have those same expectations of themselves. The world is full of stories of people being sent help and refusing it and then wondering why nobody come and saved them, kind of thing. So we see that several times in some of the definitions that we've talked about, and this whole issue on social research. We have to understand both the short and the long-term impacts. For those of you that are interested in sociology and psychology, you've got a whole career ahead of you just researching the impacts of COVID-19 and the lockdown, the impact on family structure, the impact on student socialization, the impact of just being isolated and not being able to get out. And that's more of a problem, in my opinion, for people in large metropolitan areas where they live in big condos stacked on top of each other and can't get out. Guys like me who live in the country, there hasn't really been that much change in my lifestyle. My dog is vaccinated, so I won't get rabies, but other than that, we're in pretty good shape. So that what this talks about is this, we have to understand the social order and the processes. And we talked about the processes last Tuesday as well in terms of human interaction. We talked about the issue of interoperability and the way it relates to strategic versus tactical planning. And this idea is that we can have all the technology in place, but if we don't understand the nature of the relationships, technology in and of itself isn't going to solve any problems. So we need to look at both the social order and the communities and how communities relate and react to everything, right? To get a full understanding of what goes on. And so what this suggests is this recent scholarship. We have a way to look at those things, and you'll see in some of these definitions coming up how important that role of community is, that role of people. And there are several things that have been going on lately. If you've been following the news, there's been several of those feel-good stories about people working together in response to Ida, all the way from New Orleans up to New England. People working together and jumping out and stepping up. And there was even a piece, they have a lot going on PBS this week. Was coming up with the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And again, talking about people just chipped in. People were just there and kind of helped out. So, understanding that gets to be an important aspect in why people choose to help and why they don't, and what efforts are able to put in. So that's an important aspect. And this is the quote that starts out this entire third chapter as we move forward. We spent the first two times talking about history and the importance of learning from history. And any of you that ever done research, the biggest problem with research is getting data, accurate data that you can count on. And one of the problems, as I said before, my early plan was to get a degree and finish my doctorate in prehistory. Figured there'd be less reading. I think that's pretty funny, I'm sorry. Anybody do any camping? I've also got a proposal to move forward with packages of dehydrated water. Just open the packet and add water, and there you go. I'm sorry, this is Thursday morning. And there was a person who filed a complaint. They went online, and there was an advertisement for a solar clothes dryer. talk about perceptions and the way we look at things. And so they got their solar clothes dryer in the mail. It was a piece of line and some clothespins. Right? Our expectations, our pre-existing beliefs cause us to look at things that aren't the way they are. And that's what that's all about. So anyway, so history is an important thing to keep in mind, to look at, to learn from. And the one thing we've gotten better at is keeping track of what's happening historically. So a lot of the early stuff, and your text makes this point, oftentimes the way we know about early disasters is because somebody has written it down. That's how we know a bit about Pompeii and the fires in Spain and in England and all those places we talked about, right? But the problem is they tend to be anecdotal. And what does anecdotal mean? What's an anecdote?
Not always true.
Yeah, it's somebody's reflections or a story that gets told over and over again, and there may be elements of truth, but you can't count on the whole thing because this gets colored by time. Absolutely. And so a lot of this evidence is anecdotal, and as we all know, we can both, or all of us can look at the same event and have different takeaways, right? And that's an important part of that. It can be incomplete, and they can just highlight the points that are important to us or important to them at the time. And we do that the same way now if we're not careful. We have this thing, it's called the recency effect. You ever heard the term recency effect? No? What does it mean?
That's like when you only prepare, how you prepare when you only kind of recognize what just happened.
Yeah, so that recency effect, exactly right. We tend to just relate or remember or prepare for what's most recent in our mind. And so they can become incomplete for that reason. And then also there are a whole lot of unrecorded events that we're only finding out through archaeology. And going back and finding layers of ash, several layers. That's the one class I always wished I'd taken in college was a geology class. I thought that would have been fascinating. Because I lived in Southern California, we'd drive from LA up to the high desert, and you'd go past places where the San Andreas Fault was exposed, and to see the shift, they'll come in with the horizontal lines and then it just shift up. Anyway. So unrecorded events are only now finding out about. And then, the part is that there are some historical records that we don't put a whole lot of credibility into. And just from recent studies, one of the great examples are a lot of the stories in the Old Testament of the Bible. There's currently no historical evidence other than that recording, and yet doing archaeological research in that area, they're finding that there's some validity to a lot of those stories. So again, those unrecorded events that now with technology increasing, the infrared scanning and things that we can do, we can go back and find more information about those things. And it gets to be fascinating. But again, as important as history is, we always have to remember that it's incomplete. As most of the things we've talked about, this movement toward a more professional approach to emergency management, started about 60 years ago. And a lot of it was driven by military and military response to the Cold War and civil defense and, drop, tuck, and roll, or roll and tuck, or whatever, the stuff that you went through. And so these efforts here as well are relatively recent in the grand scheme of things. National Opinion Research Center. What's the National Opinion Research Center and where is it located?
Is it a common state?
Huh?
Is it like a common state?
It's a very common state, yes. A very big city with a large university on the banks of Lake Michigan.
Michigan.
On the western bank of Lake Michigan.
Wisconsin.
South of that. Chicago, yeah.
I was actually going to guess it.
I'm trying to help, but University of Chicago has a National Opinion Research Center. It's a massive organization at University of Chicago, and they have done a lot of research and continue to do research. And most of their research is public opinion survey research data, which is then getting at what? People's attitudes, people's expectations as we go forward. The National Research Group at the National Academy of Sciences came along about that time. Again, to look at disasters and research and emergencies. And in any of your studies, have you ever heard of the Hawthorne effect? No? Hawthorne was a General Electric plant in Hawthorne, New Jersey. And they wanted to study the impact of changing lighting on productivity. So they started, increasing the light, and performance got better. So they then started decreasing the light, and performance got better. And no matter what they did, performance got better. And so the Hawthorne effect has come to represent the idea that if people know they're being studied, they sometimes change their behavior just because they know they're being studied. The Hawthorne effect. It's like in the bad old days when people like Nielsen Media used to mail out cards for people to say what shows they watched. There was a tendency for people to over-report watching educational shows, documentaries, news feeds, and stuff like that, and not watching soap operas and sporting events and all cartoons and whatnot. So the worried well syndrome, how might that be similar to the Hawthorne effect? The text talks about it. So look at the first two words. Worried well. If you're feeling well, what does that mean? You're feeling okay, right? Everything's fine. Well, so the worried well syndrome means people are okay, but because this is going on around them, they then have the symptoms. They have things in childbirth called sympathetic pregnancy pain, right? Because somebody around you is feeling it, you feel it. Or if a lot of people have it, gee, I must have it. I had it when my dad died of cancer, and immediately when I went to the doctor, I had spots on my lungs. Oh no, I've got cancer, I'm gonna die, right? And the reality was it was just a fungus because I lived along the shores of Lake Michigan for a bunch of years growing up, right? So that worried well syndrome, and so looking at that and how does that impact, and what's that impact on the healthcare system? When people are perfectly healthy, but because there's so much going around them, they must have it, right? Gets to be an important part of it. And so what both the National Opinion Research Center and the Disaster Research Group did was looked at both organization and individual response and reaction to disasters. This notion that it's just not enough to look at how organizations respond, what kind of preparedness they have, what kind of issues they have dealing with, but how people react and respond. And both in the short term and the long term. Why is it that, with 9/11, what was one of the, they have the Tunnel to Towers run coming up, I think, tomorrow in Columbia. Have you heard of the Tunnel to Towers run? What's that all about?
So that's just, I know it's before 9/11. I've heard it on the radio before, but the actual definition, I don't know what it is.
Okay.
I just know it's like a charity.
Yeah, it's a big charity, and what it is funded by a guy whose brother was a firefighter. And as he was going to try to respond, I think he was stuck in a tunnel and couldn't get there because the traffic was stopped. So he donned his 60 pounds worth of firefighting gear and ran to the towers to run up to try to help people, and was killed in the collapse and whatnot. Okay, so why does somebody like that do those things? And other people right there turn and walk away. What is it about personality? What is it about it? We do that. And again, not everybody is going to respond the same way. But if we can get some studies as to why people respond. This isn't necessarily disasters, but one of the things, you all know what the Navy SEALs are, or who they are, or what they are? Yeah. One of the things that they study in those people is that through their training and whatnot, they have such low stress levels because of their ability to deal and handle with unusual situations. So one of the things that makes them effective is low stress. So there are certain occupations that tend to have that. And it's kind of it doesn't make sense on the one hand, the environment in which they operate, and they have such low stress levels. But it's through training and conditioning and things of that nature that makes it happen. There was a news clip over the weekend of a NASCAR driver who's driving at Darlington, and his pulse rate's around 100 beats a minute. He gets a higher pulse rate when he's running. You would think the adrenaline and the heat and all that kind of stuff. But you train the ability to do those. That makes a difference. You know, first responders have a tough gap. Anybody you ever work in that field or know people that work in that field? I mean, it's tough to forget your family and your house to go help somebody else. What is it about that? And so you try to look at those things, what studies, and then if you work that down, then you can help devise training or aptitude tests or things of that nature to make sure we have the right people with the right skills to be able to respond to those disaster things, right? The best football players are what? Those that have studied and practiced what the environment is, and rather than panic, they, through their training, know how to react, how to turn, all those things, right? And that comes through repetition and practice. And this is what they're talking about here. So those early efforts should focus not only on organizations, but then tended to move into individuals and communities, which is an important leap that took place in the process as we move forward. There was also an outfit called Disaster Research Group. And what they did is they were a group of sociologists and psychologists, and your book uses the term co-opted. What they basically did was use efforts by the military to see what response was to enemy action in wartime disasters, and kind of converted that, co-opted it to make it their own, to kind of look at natural disasters and other non-military disasters. So again, you see that issue, what was our early disaster response in this country was done through the military. So this early research built on what the military, because that's where the funds were going. And in the 1950s, we had the Cold War. Early 1960s, we had Cuban Missile Crisis. There's a wonderful book out that if any of you really want to look at from a historical perspective, the challenges of decision-making in an organizational environment, is called groupthink. And it's how you get a group of people together, and the old notion is they want to go along, they want to be part of the team, so everybody starts thinking the same. And you don't then question and challenge. And if you become a devil's advocate, you're not necessarily seen as a good team player, are you? When in fact, what you should be doing as a devil's advocate is questioning the assumptions that we work under. Okay, we have a disaster research center, which was first established at Ohio State in '63. And it was specifically focusing on studying organizations that were under stress, and stress caused by disasters, whether technical or human or natural or whatever they might be. They moved to the University of, of Delaware in 1985, and here is a link to the Disaster Research Center. That's an active link. I checked it out when you go and review the source of the PowerPoint. A lot of good information. The main thing is they conduct community-wide research efforts, but for our purposes, they maintain access to research, other research that's been done. How might that be helpful to look at when you start putting together your disaster plan? That might be a good resource to kind of look and see what they have available in terms of putting them together. Again, that's a link to, it's now at the University of Delaware, and they do, again, a lot of this organizations and whatnot. Natural Hazards Center is another group, but they focus on natural disasters. They're also a clearinghouse, and here's a link for them. And what they also have is this ability, they have funding that they can approve short-term grants to make sure that communities or researchers or whoever have access to immediate information that either related to the planning and preparation or to the response to a disaster that may be time sensitive. Okay. Right. So having on the ground records of emergency relief efforts, recovery efforts, high water recovery, any of those kind of things where passage of time will reduce your ability to collect data on them. They have quick turnaround information that you can build on from there. So again, there's a lot of research that's being done. It's being done for going on 60, 70 years at this point, and these are two resources that are available for you when you go back and look and want to get additional information as we move forward. Okay, for our 4 cheerful volunteers to go with the radio station, have you got a date you want to figure out yet?
The date?
We're going to do it toward the end of Monday or Friday in October.
I'm easygoing, whenever everyone else wants.
Okay.
I didn't know
We didn't. You were supposed to think about it and let me know
I
today.
thought, we were just
No, I believe in, to some extent, running this as a small d democracy.
Wait, what time is this in the morning?
Yeah, I mean 9 o'clock in the morning.
9 o'clock?
Yeah, and you'll get released from class that day to go and participate.
Oh, then I'm okay. I'm on practice.
Okay, Charlotte, you're the decision maker. You have a preference for a date?
Yeah, it could just be a surprise.
It'd be a Monday or Friday, the last 2 weeks of October.
Monday and Friday. I probably can do because I have class.
Even though I can get you out of class. Yeah,
Hell yeah.
you'll get one just like you'll get a release from class just like athletes and other things because it's a college sponsored activity.
Can we get an excuse from like all the classes for the day?
Probably not.
What if we're just like really in depth in our conversation?
Well, yeah.
Probably like the 11 o'clock would be a really good one.
We can probably get you out from the morning classes to come back afternoon.
Oh, that's cool. As long as I'm out for the 11 o'clock class, I don't care.
Okie dokie. So then I'll just pick a date.
Yeah.
Monday. Do you have a preference for a Monday or Friday?
Friday.
Friday. Okay. I'll pick a Friday and post it and let you know.
So I can see what you're talking
You gonna join us? Tristan, you gonna join us?
No, I have classes.
I can get you out of class.
I understand that, but.
Okay, just so I know you weren't here Tuesday. I just don't want you to feel left out. That you have an opportunity to join us.
about. I got tricked.
Oh, come on, nobody was tricked. I thought it was pretty cool about it. Anyway, these are, and I'll get more information from Dr. Roots to just specifically what they want. But the way it works out in the past, you'll have maybe 3 or 4 minutes at most to talk about your perspective of the importance of emergency management and emergency preparedness.
Okay, I'll choose them like a different.
Yeah, what we'll do is as we get closer in we won't worry about too much till after the break, because I want to, we've just got these exams and stuff coming along. So we'll just kind of clear it up, and I'll pick a broad topic, and then you can pick a part within that you want to focus upon.
Can we do hurricanes? Can we do something about hurricanes?
Well, specifically, what we want to be able to do is from a hurricane perspective, what are some key things that people need to keep in mind?
Leaving, preparing.
Yeah, that kind of thing, right? So you can talk about that. What happens in the event of a tornado? What are some things you can prepare to do for that, or bad
It's on
weather?
the hurricane. It's on the hurricane.
Okay. So, and like I said, we'll get with Dr. Roost and let her know the date we confirm that last 2 weeks in October, and then she'll send out the notification for being out of classes in the morning to be able to help us do those things. Because we need to have a debrief after the program anyway, so that'll take time.
Yeah,
So,
let's go through my 11 o'clock class.
okay. So we'll go from there. So again, another resource for you when you're putting things together for your projects that will help as we move forward. Your text goes at great length as why do we need a theory of emergency management? Right? And what's a theory?
An idea.
An idea. A theory is an idea that's kind of explanatory in nature. That you have an issue and you try to help explain and understand it. So you develop a theory, which is this overall intellectual framework through which you view the issue that goes on. And the 2 main ones that came around, there's some more we're going to chit-chat about, is this notion that we're not only interested in how organizations respond, and whether that's a federal, a state, a local, a volunteer, whatever it might be, how they respond, how they prepare, what they do in advance, how quickly they can mobilize their volunteer efforts, things of that nature that get to be important. It also gets into this whole issue of expectations. And remember, what can get us in trouble in some ways more so than the reality are our expectations. There's a wonderful, somewhat dated song now entitled, "Is That All There Is?" And the whole basics of the song is, as a little kid growing up, she always wanted to go to the circus, and she's all excited about going to the circus, and when she got there, well, is that all there is? And all the fire trucks are going, oh, I got to go see a fire. Is that all there is? It's like most vacations never meet your planning. Because as you're planning it, it never rains, it's never horribly hot, there's never long lines at the rides, there's always a vacancy at the hotel, right? So our expectations, and sometimes the best vacations, the best things that you do are those that you just kind of ad hoc, you decide to do it. because you don't create all those expectations. And that's one of the biggest challenges that we face in emergency management issue, is dealing with citizen expectations. As we've shown in the first 2 chapters, there's been this evolution for a variety of good reasons that were talked about, is why government should take a lead role in this disaster management, right? Because they have the size, the resources, the money, and whatnot to do it. But what's happened is we've started to expect government to do everything. And is that realistic? No. Everybody complains about taxes, paying high taxes, but yet they want services. They don't want to pay taxes, but they want an ambulance 5 minutes away. They don't want to pay taxes, but they want a fire station that can be there in 5 or 10 minutes. Services cost money. And as we see, one of the differences, and Donnell did a summer project with the factories here in town, and the fact that the private sector has money. When they decide to do something, they'll do it. Public sector, that's a bit more of a get. So again, how organizations prepare and respond, and how public expectations impact that. And that's a real challenge, meeting expectations, because oftentimes they're unrealistic. And the research seeks to understand, and hopefully by understanding can help predict and explain disasters themselves and how people respond. What does it take? I mean, and one of my jobs in the military was mobilization planning, getting people ready to get called to active duty. And the first problem is, everybody wants the paycheck, but nobody wants to get mobilized to go on active duty, right? So how do we get people prepared for those things? How do you get them to understand the importance of having a will, having the powers of attorney, having those mundane little activities that make all the difference in the world if you get mobilized and have a quick mobilization recall. In the best world scenario in those cases, what you're able to do is have some kind of orientation and indoctrination that goes through all that stuff. But what is this thing yesterday? Some 5,000 National Guard troops are working in and around New Orleans to kind of supplement law enforcement in that area. So getting people enthusiastic or concerned or responsive to things I hope never happen, or at least hope never happen to them, is a real challenge. And what do we do? When I was at the University of South Carolina, we did several studies for South Carolina State in people's preparedness for emergencies. And the lack of individual preparedness was ridiculous. We've talked about several times in here, just on our own level, how much of us would be prepared if we were to lose power for 5 days. Would you have food? Would you have water? So you try to look to those things. What are communities doing to work together to provide some kind of unified response and whatnot to a disaster? And when you define community, are you talking about segments just around that's being impacted, or the community at large? And so definitions get to be a real challenge. So we're moving toward this series to help predict and explain, or explain and then predict based on our explanations, to understand disasters, how they happen, and what we can do to prepare the remediation, those 4 stages we talked about. But also we've learned that there is a social or societal impact of disasters, right? That long after. And they're still recovering in Haiti, as we mentioned. There's still parts of Colombia that haven't recovered from the flooding in Colombia. That was, 4 or 5 years ago? And then it's going to take time. What's the social impact as we go through? Important to move on from there. Yeah, this is one of those issues that I hope jumps out and makes sense to you. So what is a disaster, an emergency, or catastrophe is a broad question. But the important part here is that by what you say something is, you're also saying what it is not. So in that sense, definitions are limitations. And as we learned in the policy class last semester, the big issue in policy is defining the problem. And if you can define the problem, then you control the solution. That's what definitions do. And so by saying what something is, you're saying what it's not. And they can be limitations. And so that's why words matter. You know, that's why it makes a difference what you call something. And then we run into the challenge in this community that words can have multiple meanings. And I always like to use this example. I would like everybody to bring in a stool sample next Tuesday.
No, sir.
Hmm?
No, sir.
Okay, why? Huh? Okay, but you're viewing a stool as a biological.
Yeah.
Okay, what's another definition of a stool?
Oh, just stool.
A bar stool, right? You see, and that's the very problem, isn't it? And that's back to our pre-existing ideas and definitions of terms.
Anyway.
Huh? I try to be thoughtful. You know what it's like? There's a word in the English language that means both literally tied to and yet going away from.
We have to guess what the word is.
Yeah, what do you think? It's a word that literally means being tied to, but also going away from.
What is start with?
Be.
B?
Be, as in boy. It's not boy, but it's be. Followed by an O. Bound. Yeah. Bound. Yeah, right? I mean, bound means literally tied to, but I'm bound to Chicago. So that's why words are so difficult and why we need to have concrete definitions and why even those definitions can be ambiguous because words have different meanings. So obviously the stool I want you to bring in is a bar stool,
Yeah,
right?
God, okay.
Right? You see, that's just a hypothetical. But see, that's a challenge, isn't it? Is that words have meanings, they have perceptions that mean something to us, right? And that it changes the way we interpret, the way things get said. So that's why definitions, why words matter so much when we're talking about issues, talking about challenges. And so I've got several slides coming up here that talk about definitions. So not only are definitions nice because they're supposed to clarify, but they also can become limitations. And then words by their nature can be ambiguous because they can have different meanings. You start to see the problem of defining something. Okay. Now, and I love this notion that what you see depends on where you sit. And it's like we talked early on, and we'll use these examples across the board. Is alcoholism a choice or a disease?
Disease.
A lot of people don't view it as a disease, though, do they?
No.
They view it as a choice. And I would suggest to you whether you view it as a choice or disease makes a difference in how you react to people who have problems with alcohol and are alcoholics. And it makes a difference how the government responds to it.
I mean, I think you have a choice on whether or not you try to quit it, but I feel like it's a disease.
Yeah, I've got a cousin of mine who's alcoholic, and he quit drinking many years ago. And his wife came up to him and said, "You can have a family, you can have a drink. Choose one."
Someone like that.
To his credit, he chose family. But we were talking about this back to the disease aspect of it. And I said, you know, I'm kind of lucky. If somebody told me tomorrow I could never have another drink, okay, fine, no big deal. I mean, have it or not have it, doesn't bother me. He said, that's the problem I have. Even after all these years, I wake up every morning wanting a drink. Right? And so if we view it as a disease, it changes our whole public response to it and our ability to get people treatment and help, like with any illness, right? As opposed to penalize. You have that same issue with drug addiction. Is it a choice, or is it a disease? You know, and then we think about it in terms of that. But we also have psychological addictions. All these things that go into it, right? And so how we view things makes a big difference on how do we respond to it. And that's something. In law enforcement, what's the purpose of putting people in jail? Is it punishment? Right? Is it protection, right? Or is it an ability to rehabilitate?
I mean, I think somewhat rehabilitation, but I feel like there's other sources that they can go to, other outlets than prison.
The point being, though, whether you view it as a rehabilitation or punishment makes a difference on how you look at it. If it's rehabilitation, then you should be supporting opportunity to get college classes or learn a technical skill or whatnot. If you view it as punishment, why should they have access to what the people in the general public don't necessarily have access to? Right? They're supposed to be punished, not in a country club. So again, how we view things makes all the difference in the world on how we perceive the problem and how we respond and prepare for it. So if there are natural events beyond our control, well, let's just do what we can and not worry about it. It's going to happen no matter what we do. If, however, you see it as the next definition, according to our text, if one accepts, however, that disasters are the direct result of vulnerable society to specific events, most of which are foreseeable, then it follows that realistic steps can be taken to reduce vulnerability and prepare. Yeah. If it's, we have no control, then what difference does it make? But if we accept the second definition, it's back to those 4 stages we talked about. Not only preparedness, but remediation to begin with. And you see that now, as we mentioned, all that money that was spent in New Orleans because of external factors, climate change, rising sea levels and whatnot, all that $14 billion is going to be obsolete by the next century, by the next decade. How we view things, how we look at things, right? And that gets into a range of areas. Most of you are aware of the debate over climate change, right? And what's one of the main natures parts of the debate?
The ice caps are melting.
Okay, but more fundamental than that. What's the basic argument? It's been a big political battle. One side says it's human impact,
Oh, yeah.
right? And says we need to do things to eliminate human impact on climate. The other side said there's no connection. And so rather than debating what's causing it, what should we do, perhaps? Accept the fact that it's happening. Right? Blame who you want, but we know that sea levels are rising. We know that glaciers are melting. We know that one of the big geospatial arguments in defense is now the northern parts where the ice caps are melting. And so we now have sea lanes going up around the North Pole above Canada. And the Soviet Union, who owns that? No open sea lines. The Russians, for instance, are moving military forces up into that area. Right? Why? Because man caused it? Who cares? The fact is that's our reality. We know we have rising sea levels. We know that there are small island communities that in the next 10 years, if things don't change, will no longer exist because they'll be completely underwater. So that's why what we see depends on where we sit. If you want to focus on causes, that's great. Right? That's a valid discussion. But the reality is that things are changing. And are there things we can do about it? And if so, let's do them. If there are things we can put in place now to help minimize that impact, why shouldn't we be doing those things now? And you see that I have an infestation of armadillo who are moving into our area because why? Climate change, looking for more stuff. Fortunately, my dog is an armadillo hunter. That's the good news. The bad news, he thinks he's a cat. So whenever he kills something, he's got to bring it and show it to me, which is... Anyway, okay. So again, are disasters acts of God over which we have no control? Or are they vulnerabilities that we as a society have and we can do something to protect and help minimize the impact of that disaster? And one would hope, and I think the point of this whole class is this idea is, yes, stuff happens. But we have now the technology, we have the historical knowledge, we have the background to understand that they do happen and what the impact will be and what we can do to help mitigate, to help minimize those things. And that's a debate, that's a challenge. And in a public sector environment, funding gets to be the tough call. Because nobody, everybody wants stuff for free. And there's no such thing as a free lunch. There's none of that free government money. Somebody's paying for it. So again, definitions are critical. So your text goes to great length talking about this notion of hierarchy of disasters. And what does a hierarchy mean? Ranking, right? It's viewed as a horizontal listing, as you will, from the most to the least. And why might there need to be a hierarchy of disasters?
So we don't pour everything into a small disaster?
Yeah, so we don't pour everything into small stuff. Let's prioritize what should be there, absolutely. And what's the drawback of that? Pardon me?
If we don't do enough.
Don't do enough. Well, more fundamentally, and I've got a slide coming up here, 3 inches of snow, should we close everything down?
No,
Do we?
yeah,
Yeah. How do people in Chicago think about 3 inches of snow?
they don't like,
They don't care.
yeah.
It's no big deal. That happens all the time. Down south, 3 inches of snow is the big deal.
Like 12 inches of rain.
Okay? But why is that? Why is 3 inches of snow such a bigger deal in South Carolina, in Newberry, than it is in Chicago?
Because it's common.
It's common in Chicago. What are other reasons why it might not be as big a deal? They're prepared, right? They have snow plows. They have big stockpiles of salt, right? They're not like in South Carolina where you have to go and convert vehicles from one use to another use to be able to get out and do it. And so that's why this hierarchy of disasters can be in the severity of the disaster, but it also has to take into account what? Vulnerable populations and what the available resources are. So a hurricane goes through an area. Who's in a better position to recover and respond? Large population centers or small population centers?
Like small.
Who's going to get electricity back sooner, New Orleans or Laplace?
The larger.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have any tissues in here?
I don't know, recommend these.
Oh, really, it's okay.
Huh? You see? Definitions. That's a sanitary tissue that you wipe your desk with.
Yeah, but not my face.
Huh? See, but you didn't say face tissues. Words, right? And that's a stupid example, but that's exactly the point, right?
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important we have some kind of definitions out there. And I do not see any, and I don't have any in my office.
Do you want me to ask Bruce?
It's okay, I can just blow my nose.
That's why you have a mask.
Blow my nose in my nose. I would throw up if I even handling that.
So again, this is why I use this example. 3 inches of snow in Chicago is much different than 3 inches of snow in New Orleans, in Newberry. Because it's not necessarily so where the disaster has an impact, right? Whether it's a snowstorm or a flood or whatever that impacts, but more of the impact is a result of vulnerabilities of the areas where it happens. Flooding, and one of the interesting things about levees, and you see that every year or so when the Mississippi River floods, those areas that have levees are protected, but what happens to those areas that don't have levees? They get inundated with water. Why? Because those levees, in fact, become a channel that forces all that water, rather than let it dissipate occasionally, to get dumped out in one broad area. Many moons ago, when they first built the interstate across bottom parts of Alabama, Mississippi, going into Louisiana, they noticed that they were having a lot of flooding on the upside of the interstate. Then they realized part of the problem was that that interstate became a dam to prevent the water from getting out. So they went back and had to redesign it with more bridges and ways for the water to get through. So understanding the environment, understanding the challenge at the local level, those vulnerable populations. You know, elderly populations are more vulnerable, so we need to have perhaps different. Young children are vulnerable populations, right? What do we have in mind, and how do we protect them and keep families together, things of that nature. And then, so not only the disaster itself, and this is a great test question, right? The relative nature of disasters is first the disaster itself, second is the vulnerable population, and whether that's a vulnerability based on geography, based on socioeconomic factors, whatever it might be, vulnerability in the large sense is what we're talking about here. And then available resources. You know, who has the resources? And those resources are not just money, but they are the technical ability, the equipment, the people, the trained people to get out and do that. I always love it. I'm on a road that's one of the last roads to get scraped or plowed when we have snowstorms, and so most of it turns to ice. But I can always tell when the snow plows are coming because there's a thump, thump, thump. They're stripping off those nice little markers in the middle of the road, and then a few weeks later there's somebody coming back, posting them back along the way. So again, these three issues that make disasters in some ways relative. The disaster itself, vulnerable populations, and available resources. And again, a good easy example is 3 inches of snow in Chicago and 3 inches of snow in New Orleans, in Newberry. It gives you a great sense of it's not, in that case, necessarily the disaster, but the population and their ability, the capability they have to respond to it. So that's one of the challenges. So the hierarchy is a good thing, right? But then we have this that complicates it even more. It would be nice if we had easy answers, wouldn't it? We had some nice, simple answers, but heck, that would be no fun as we move forward. So from a research point of view, your text makes a good point about this. What's the difference between quantitative and qualitative?
Quantitative is an amount, qualitative is like that.
Good way to put it, yeah. Yeah, quantitative is a quantity. It's data, it's numbers. Right? Qualitative is more like quality of life issues. And so where the big difference in research becomes is whether it's quantitative, you go out and do surveys and collect a bunch of data about it. The other one is to go out and do in-person interviews. You know, talk to people, get from an individual perspective input, and that becomes this idea of qualitative. It deals with the quality issue. And so then from a research point of view, there is currently a bias within the discipline for quantitative data. They want you to do quantitative analysis. What's your data source? How do you collect data? How valid is your data? All those questions. But in emergency response, you need to have both because, again, we're looking at quality of life issues on vulnerable populations and studying the impact not only on the resources in the community, but on the people. And so each perspective will make a difference. If it's simply quantitative, we are not as concerned necessarily from a data collection point of view of quality of life. It's getting the facts, just the facts. Quantitative is a different skill set. And one of the problems that even comes in getting this data when Hurricane Katrina went through New Orleans, had a colleague of mine who ran a survey research unit at the University of New Orleans. They were heavily impacted by the hurricane. And money was made available for doing public opinion research to get information at that qualitative level about quality of life issues, right? So it would make sense that if you have a research unit in the community where the disaster happened, that you was use them, right? Yeah. You went to the big monies, the Harvards and the the Research Center, right, at University of Chicago, National Opinion Research Center. And then in the ultimate irony, they called Susan to ask for her help to put it together. Didn't offer any money to do it. Didn't offer any financial backing to help her recover her own unit. But it went to somebody out of state. So even in that respect, politics gets involved in the process of how things happen and in the research that gets done. And I would suggest that from a pure research point of view, people who've been in the community, who have a connection with the community, and can use a resource are to be in a better position to get good, reliable data in the process. But that's not always what happens as we go forward. Okay, you'll see in this highlighted area, there is a link to the Civil Preparedness Guide, which you can go through. And it has definitions for emergency and for disaster. And again, definitions make a difference. Words have meanings. So according to the Civil Preparedness Guide, an emergency is any incident, whether natural or human cause, that requires responsive action to protect life or property. So my house fire is an emergency because I need immediate response to help out. Is my house fire a disaster?
Depends if it spreads to other.
That's not what the question was. Is my house fire in and of itself a disaster?
No.
No, it's an emergency. It needs to be dealt with. It moves to a disaster when?
When it spreads.
When it spreads. When you get more stuff involved, when it goes out. And that's important to understand. So according to the Civil Preparedness Guide, disaster is an occurrence of a natural disaster, technological accident, or human-caused incidents that results in severe property damage, death, and/or multiple injuries. A large-scale disaster is one that exceeds the response capabilities of local jurisdictions. So it's a size issue, the impact, overall impact. An important distinction, because again, whether it's emergency or a disaster makes a difference as to what funds are available, what resources are available to you. Most things that are at the emergency level are handled by the local and or the state level or tribal government or whoever has it, right? Because again, they're a disaster for the person it's happening to. And so, you know, in the military, we had a definition over what was a disaster, and our definition of disaster related directly to loss of life. If you had X number of people, it was an emergency. If you had more than that number, it became a disaster. And those definitions then make a difference how we respond and what's available. So again, differences between the emergency and a disaster. Definitions make a big difference as we go through. The Stafford Act, which we mentioned several times in the first two chapters, that kind of is the overarching federal legislation that deals with disaster preparedness. And this is also a link to the Stafford Act to go back and get information. And in their definition, an emergency is any occasion or instance for which, in the determination of the president, federal assistance is needed to supplement state, tribal, and local efforts and capabilities to save lives and protect property and public health and safety, or to lessen or avert the threat of a catastrophe in any part of the United States. So what is one of the key differences between the Stafford Act's definition of emergency and our previous definition of emergency? Yeah?
They say that the president.
The president, yeah. Yeah. The events are basically the same. The question is, one, does the president determine it's an emergency that's worthy and needs a federal response? Right? So again, that highlights this notion that comes more apparent as we go through the semester, that the first responders is the local. And the state then supplements the local, and then the federal supplements the state activities that go on. So again, it's that hierarchy of response. As we've said several times, government's role is what? Oversight, right? They're that managerial oversight. They have primarily dollars on their side, but they don't necessarily have the technical expertise or the capability to respond to those things, right? And then that's why we need more volunteer efforts, more collaboration, more cooperation between and among different groups and organizations that have a role in emergency response, such as the American Red Cross and other volunteer groups that go through. So again, definitions make a difference. According to the Stafford Act, a major disaster is any natural catastrophe, and then they go on and list hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, things of that nature. Or regardless of cause, any fire, flood in any part of the United States, which in the determination of the president causes damage of sufficient severity and magnitude to warrant major disaster assistance. So again, their definitions are different. It's from the federal level. It's up to the president to declare it a major disaster. And then that's then one of magnitude.
Don't they also have it in like the state constitutions now that like the emergencies are declared by the governor?
Not that I'm aware of.
Not that
If you've got a source that tells you that, let me know, because I'd like to add it in. I know in South Carolina we're currently having a debate over who can declare an emergency. And the interesting debate is that it depends. And so the nature of the current debate is whether the issue with masks and vaccines is a choice issue or a public health issue. And if you view it as a public health issue, then you have one response. If you view it as a parental choice issue, then you have a different set of responses. So what you're seeing is municipalities have the ability to declare emergencies. Since I believe Casey just put in a mask ordinance in several other states, several other cities in South Carolina. There are a couple cities that have mandated vaccines for all their employees. And so there are going to be issues that come up. So yeah, if you've got something that says states have that, let me know. In general, you would think they have it because they're, and most Constitution talks about health and safety issues, and you could write that broad extension. But then it comes, if the governor doesn't declare a disaster, to what degree does the sub-state governments have to declare disasters, and the extent of those things. And what South Carolina has said, do what you want to do, but if it has to do with state money, you don't have any control over it. Okay. Again, definitions, words make a difference. And that's a challenge that we face in the process. Do that, okay? So again, these two resources are there and available for you to get up and use as we go forward. So what we see out of this is the beginnings of the social science response to this theory of emergency preparedness, emergency disaster response. And what that does is represents a shift away from just the military taking control of everything to a broader understanding that disasters have both short and long-term impacts. And those short and long-term impacts are not only on resources, on natural resources, on technology and things, they also have long-lasting impacts on us as individuals. Disasters that go through. Talk about people who are trapped in their cars for hours, or people who went through hurricanes because they couldn't evacuate. They're going to have long-term issues and challenges that deal with that. And so what we're trying to do with this using social sciences is understand that and build that into our emergency plans. What do we have available? Now, what's one great response to an emergency or disaster that you see now in a lot of schools? K through 12 schools, even colleges is appropriate. What's one of the human perspectives on an emergency or disaster that recognizes potential long-term impacts? After the lockdown drill.
I was just thinking about school shooter drills.
Yeah. Oftentimes they have counselors
Oh, yeah.
that go into the schools, right? For students that need counselors. Why? Because they recognize that a traumatic event, if not addressed, can have long-term impacts. And so you see that not only when there's a school shooting or they go into lockdown or things of that nature, but you also see it recently when they've had a couple of athletes here in South Carolina high schools. And they had grief counselors go in and make available to the students to deal with that, to talk about it. You see that in Aiken, where they've had two K through 12 students pass from COVID in the last week. They'll have grief counselors. And why? Because we understand the long-term impact of emergencies of any kind on human psyche. And if you've ever come up on a traffic accident where people have been injured and the emergency folks haven't shown up yet, it's not always a pretty sight. And that can have an impact on you. So that's what all these studies have come about and starting addressing, is this importance of understanding the long-term impact on individuals and therefore on communities of interest that take place. So we've got that shift. And then with the growth of research, again, it's designed for those two broad areas, not only the disaster itself, but the impacts on communities and individuals. And once again, in the early efforts, we see this transition away from simply a military focus, civil defense focus, to one of emergency management, emergency response, emergency preparedness, and its impact on individuals. Make sense? Questions? Comments? Okay. So the routine for Tuesday is that we will finish up chapter 3 and then have a bit of time for any questions you may have in preparation for the exam. The exam will be done on Thursday. You'll have 50 minutes, so that allows us about 15, 20 minutes to start on the next chapter to move forward from then. And then the next test will be the Tuesday before you go on fall break, which I think is October 7th, 5th, or whatever. 7th, I think. But that Tuesday before you go on fall break, we'll have the second exam. And then I'm putting together, a question has been asked about the critical review essays. I'm waiting now. I had a couple in mind, but I want to wait for the first stuff to come back after Ida. Because again, that's a recent event, and it would be nice to do something on something we've all had recency and familiarity with, and stuff like that. Okay. So some of the takeaways, again, this impact of the recency effect, this idea, of the well people speaking, they have diseases and symptoms just because it's there. Good takeaways. Questions? Pretty exciting. What's everybody doing tomorrow night at 6 o'clock?
Tomorrow at 6 o'clock, no idea.
Good. Saturday at 6 o'clock.
I'm watching the Florida USF game on Saturday.
Saturday night?
Good afternoon.
Okay, because 6 o'clock, what happens at 6 o'clock on Saturday? Huh? I'm trying to help you out here, boss.
Oh, is it a football game?
Football
I'm so
game.
sorry, I don't pay attention to.
And the big thing about this one is they're starting a new tradition this year, calling what the Wolf Walk or some such thing. They're going to gather away from there, do a little pep rally and whatnot about 5 o'clock, a little after that, and then go en masse to the stadium.
That is just so weird that I did not know that you were.
I'm shocked. I'm trying to give you a plug here. How am I doing? Okay. Well, if no questions, go forth, do good work, have a good weekend. Questions, comments, let me know. And these will be posted, this tentative schedule will be posted, and you can catch them online.